and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of our summer series on stories and storytelling. I was on vacation last week and missed what I'm sure was a wonderful session with Dr. Judith Hellman, so I'm happy to be back with you this week. Welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today, and if you want to catch up on previous sessions, you can do that on the series page, which was in the email that you received. We're so happy today to have a new faculty member teaching us. Dr. Beverly Bayless is Adjunct Associate Professor of Jewish Literature at JTS, and Tani will introduce her more fully. But her session is called The Protest Literature of Mizrahi Writers, and she's going to be exploring with us how their stories, the stories of writers who may be, well, she'll tell us more, but who may be marginalized by the mainstream culture or may have been in the past, how their stories give voice to that whole experience in Israeli society. I want to actually just give you a heads up about our high holiday learning before we continue with today's session. So the current series continues through August 22nd. We will then take off 1 week, just because, and we'll take off Labor Day. Then we're going to have 2 high holiday learning sessions for you on September 12th and 19th with Rabbi Michal Springer and Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, who you know if you've been learning with us. So we're really looking forward to those very sessions that I know will be challenging and meaningful, as their teaching always is. You do need to register separately for that series. So we've sent it out by email, but do keep an eye on your email for that. And you can also sign up on the website. And then we have a whole bunch of Monday holidays. And then our fall series is going to be picking up after the holidays on October 24th, but that's a ways away. So we will keep you posted many times before then. If you are feeling inspired by the opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we would love for you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We have 3 sponsorship levels, Chacham, Sadiq, and Navi, for $540, $1,000, and $1,800 respectively. And you can learn more by going to the website that has just been posted in the chat. And thank you to all our past and future sponsors, and to all of you for the gifts that you make when you register. On that note, I will turn it over to Tani Schwartzman.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the format for our session, Dr. Bailis will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end of our session. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Bailis. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier this morning. We'll be screen sharing a PowerPoint presentation today that incorporate the sources as well, the text. So pleased to introduce Dr. Beverly Bayless, Associate Adjunct Professor in Modern Jewish Literature at JTS. She specializes in modern Hebrew, Jewish literature, and gender studies. She is currently a co-editor of the forthcoming book, American Hebraeus, Essays on Modern Hebrew and Jewish Literature and Literary Culture by Alan Mintz. This anthology is in honor of her former dissertation advisor at JTS, Alan Mintz. You can read more about her on her full bio is included with the sources that we shared. I'm going to go ahead now and turn it over to Dr. Bailis.
Hi, thank you, Tani and Julia, for the introduction and for the opportunity to discuss these poems with you today. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are attending this webinar. I'm very excited to share this material with you and to hear your comments and questions as well. So at first, I just wanted to kind of tie this discussion today to some of the larger questions of the series. I think that the idea of Jewish stories is very compelling, and some of the questions that I really am going to be focusing in on that were shared with me at the beginning of planning the session are the following. I'd like to think about what roles do stories and storytelling play in Jewish communities? How do they communicate values, norms, and cultural assumptions? And what is the power of shared stories? And then to add to these kinds of questions, with the particular case of Mizrahi protest poetry, I like to think about, whose stories are told, whose stories are heard, whose stories are taught and centered, and which ones are marginal and elided. And so the texts that I'm going to share with you today are texts that I've incorporated into my introduction to Israeli literature classes over the years. And the aim of that course is really to bring a diversity of perspectives into the classroom. Because these texts that I'm sharing with you, they were not a part of the canon when I was a student being introduced to Hebrew literature. And I think that these texts fit very well within the larger series on Jewish storytelling, because they really bring important voices and experiences from the Mizrahi community in Israel. And as we look at each poem, the specific kinds of frame that I want to give to them and questions to think about are what lens or perspective is being centered in the text, who is marginalized, who is invisible or missing, and where is power? So first, I just want to give a little bit of background information, because for some of you, I'm sure that this history is very familiar, and others might not have been thinking about this for some time. So when we think about the term Mizrahi, even, we're thinking about Israeli Jews with roots in Islamic countries, such as Iran, Iraq, Egypt, Morocco, Syria, and some other countries. And the term literally means Easterner, like from the East, Mizrahi. And it refers to a collective identity that was created in Israel to distinguish the totality of Asian, African, and Southeastern European Jews, as opposed to the population of Eastern, Western, and Central European Jews, who are collectively referred to as Ashkenazim. So, and at sometimes Mizrahim has also been subsumed under the heading or the name Sfaradim, which has also referred specifically to the descendants of the Spanish exiles, many of whom settled throughout Greece, Turkey, Italy, and the Balkans, and spoke Ladino rather than Arabic. So when we use the term Mizrahi, essentially what this is a social construct. There's no, given, transparent, essentialized, or primordial identity that is Mizrahi. It is a construct. And the term itself functions as a kind of protest. When Jews from Asia and Africa arrived to Israel, they were, at the very beginning of the state, they were collectively and patronizingly called Edut HaMizrach, or Oriental communities. And this was kind of like a single category that was created, a term, to denote intra-Jewish ethnic groups. But what it did is this term sort of stripped the different individuals from the countries that they came from in order to make it sort of like ideologically acceptable to the status quo, to mainstream Ashkenazi society. So it took away identifiers such as like Arab or Persian or Arabic. And in time, the Mizrahim came to accept this hegemonic image of identity of sameness, and they tried to imbue it with a political meaning that was both positive and assertive. And they considered it, becoming Mizrahim. So this, in some ways, this kind of protest is similar to what we see like in the gay community, in the LGBTQ community, who have taken the word queer that had been something sort of placed on them as a pejorative term, an identifier, but then like inverting it and taking it on and reinventing it and using it to their advantage. So we can think of the very term Mizrahi in that sense. So, so now just a little bit of historical context is that there has been a history of the social and economic inequality in Israel with the Mizrahim. So as we know, pre-state Israel, had been several different waves of immigration called aliyot, like the first aliyah, the second aliyah, the third aliyah, and they were mostly Jews who came from Russia and Eastern Europe. And they brought with them European Western culture, Ashkenazi culture. Many of them were Yiddish speaking or had backgrounds in other European languages. And they set the cultural and social tone of the Yishuv of pre-state Israel. And at this time, 90% of the immigrants were from this part of the world, from Europe. But immediately following statehood, there were large waves of immigration beginning even in 1947 and the early 1950s. And most of the immigrants at this time were Jews from the Middle East. And in 1949, we see a lot of Jews coming from Yemen and thousands from Tunisia, Turkey, and Libya. And then in 1950, Iraqi Jews began immigrating to Israel, making aliyah. And they were enabled, they could renounce their Iraqi citizenship and they could come and settle in Israel. So, but before they had left, the Iraqi Jews had been very much a part of Iraq, a part of the economy and culture of Iraq. And as a result of the establishment of the state of Israel and the War of 1948, there was like an increasing, the conflict in Israel-Palestine sort of increased tensions between Jews and Muslims throughout the Muslim world. And so there was like a kind of rise in Arab nationalism, and there was an impetus for Jews to leave at this time. And they felt that suddenly undermined from their like comfortable bourgeois position in Iraq. And they felt that they were at the mercy of the government for equal rights. So given all of this, a lot of Iraqi Jewish citizens turned to Zionism. And so the Iraqi government at this time thought that about 10,000 Jews would leave and come to Israel. And Israel anticipated about 30,000 to 40,000 coming, but it ended up snowballing, and essentially 120,000 immigrants came. And in 1951, the Iraqi government froze Jewish assets. And between 1950 and 1951, the entire Jewish community came. So, and I just want to refer, a lot of this history comes from this book that I've found really helpful in teaching and learning about Israeli history. It's a book by Anita Shapira, and it's called Israel, A History. And she has a really wonderful chapter specifically about this time period and experience of the Mizrahim. So, so many more people came than were anticipated, and Israel couldn't turn them away. And, you know, they were fleeing political situations that they didn't know if the governments were going to keep letting them come. So, but this time period saw the arrival of these masses of people. And as a result of this, there were many social, cultural, and economic difficulties. So from the perspective of Israel, of the new state, on a very basic level, they had to reckon with, you know, how to absorb all of these people. And within 3.5 years, the Jewish population doubled in Israel, and there were 700,000 immigrants during this time. So, and as we know, right, in these years, this was right after the War of Independence, which was a costly war. And the country, it was this new state, and they were still reeling from the aftermath of the war. There was a lack of food, there was a lack of foreign currency, there was inflation, and there were even austerity measures where there was the rationing of food, and where there was like people were guaranteed like a diet of 1,600 calories. This was called the tzena, this whole food rationing time. And there were also rations on oil, sugar, margarine, and later also furniture and shoes. And then in 1952, Israel saw some reparations from Germany, which really helped the economic situation. And most rations ended by 1953, but they weren't fully abolished until 1959. So, so we see that, you know, Israel is in this kind of precarious state, and then they have so many immigrants coming. So the question was really how to absorb all of these people. So when they first came, the Israelis, they put the new immigrants into immigrant camps. And these were supposed to provide temporary housing till something more permanent was possible. And they were characterized by, you know, having barbed wire fence and food rations. And they've been described as having like overflowing latrines, only 2 running faucets for many, many people. And the situation there was rather humiliating and depressing. A lot of the immigrants had been in DP camps and had been used to living in provisional living situations set up for refugees. But again, as we know specifically from the Iraqi situation, that a lot of people had just left, you know, very comfortable bourgeois lives, and coming here they registered it as a shock. And so these rudimentary places were just, you know, erected for them. And then following the period of the just this, you know, immigration camp, there was the creation of what's called the Mahabharat, or the transit camps. And so this was also meant to be a very temporary solution, where each family would have their own unit. But the situation there was also pretty dismal in that there wasn't necessarily any running water, there was no electricity, and they were supposed to be built near other established communities to share the resources of these more established communities. But in reality, a lot of them had been built near more weaker towns, and they didn't have the resources that they needed. And the employment that was available was mostly in kind of blue collar kinds of positions of afforestation, road building, construction, that were low paid. And some of the immigrants found this kind of work degrading, that they were coming from other backgrounds. And so in 1951, there were about 220,000 immigrants living in the Mahabharat. And the perspective from Israeli society, they were in a sense seen as kind of like belonging to a world among themselves. Other Israelis didn't necessarily have contact with anyone living in the Mahabharat. It was seen as kind of like a threatening place that was dirty, posing some kind of threat to the settled country. And other Israeli citizens who had also been olim, who had also been immigrants, they said, well, you know, we also had it hard when we came to this country. Anyone who has studied the history of the Aliyot, they also engaged in similar kinds of work. And then following this period of the Mahabharat, we have the development towns. So when the immigrants moved out of the transit camps, they were settled in the least developed regions within Israel, and they were called development towns. And Israel had reasons to do this in terms of like strategy of settling the land, right? Wanting to sort of like disperse populations and to have people living there. And also from the sense of safety that they had learned from the previous wars of the earlier 20th century, that it's not good to have a country's entire population in one area, in one city, or just the cities, but there's more security if the population is spread. So while Israel had these thoughts in mind when they built these development towns, it also created a situation where it was very hard for these Mizrahi immigrants to integrate into larger Israeli society. And as I've mentioned, that a lot of them came, they suffered a decrease in their socioeconomic status. And it was also aggravated by kind of cultural and political differences within the, with the dominant Ashkenazi community. So they didn't necessarily speak spoken Hebrew, just like a lot of the Olim from Europe, but they didn't have Yiddish, which had been a shared language, or other European languages that the Ashkenazim had to communicate. So because their first language in many cases was Arabic. So there had been a kind of like sense of marginalization around these communities since the very beginning. So I just want to share some images with you. And then we'll turn to the first poem, Poverty Line. So let's see. Okay. So first I just have some images from the immigrant camps. As you can see, it's very provisional. We just see these like tents that are constructed. And we see that there's not like a paved road that the people are standing on. It seems like a dirt road. Here's a closer up look. And this is an image of the Mahabharat, or the transit camps. We can see like these kinds of shacks were constructed and set up in this way, in rows. And then later on with the development towns, we have like real buildings, and there has been development, and there's a better quality of life here, but they're also sort of more less centralized. They're more on the periphery. And here's a modern day image of a development town. So now let's turn to the poet Ronny Someck, who he came to Israel as a young child in 1951 from Baghdad, and he grew up in the Mahabharat. And after growing up in the Mahabharat, he went on to study literature and philosophy. And today he teaches literature and creative writing. He's also a musician and an artist. He's all over the internet if you want to Google him. And he's published many volumes of poetry and has won numerous prizes for his work. And he's also engaged in activism work outside of his literary artistic work. And he's worked with street gangs in Israel. And he typically has written about the landscapes either of the past, of Iraq, of the Mahabharat, and also he's written a lot of poems about Tel Aviv, one of which we'll look at a little bit later. So, first, I invite you to look at the poem Poverty Line. And as we know, the term poverty line refers to the estimated minimum level of income needed to secure the necessities of life. And one can speak of above the poverty line or below the poverty line. So I'm going to read this poem for us. And as I read, I want you to think about, I invite you to think about, how does the poverty line appear in the text? What are some of the images, sounds, and feelings in the poem? What is the speaker's attitude toward the transit camp, towards the Mahabharat, and whose voice or perspective is being centered in the poem? And lastly, where is power? So I'll read it for us now in English. Just take a sip of water. Poverty line. As if you could stretch a line and say, below it, poverty. Here's the bread made black with cheap makeup and the olives in a small plate on the tablecloth. In the air, doves flew with a soaring salute to the ringing bell held by the kerosene vendor in his red cart. And there was also the sound of rubber boots landing in the muddy ground. I was a kid in a house called a shanty, in a neighborhood they called a transit camp. The only line I saw was the horizon, and under it, everything looked poor. So upon a first reading of the poem, even beginning with the title, we have this kind of like idea of this, as if there's actually a line, like ki'ilu, it begins ki'ilu, אפשר למתוח קו ולומר מתחתיו העוני. It's as if somebody could just stand there and actually literally draw a line. And so what we have at the very beginning of the poem is this sense of high and low imagery, with something above and something below, and a kind of spatial hierarchy, where the question of power is central. There is the one who sort of stands above, perhaps even the one who is in charge of drawing this line, and has a kind of vantage point of being above. and also has perhaps, the data about poverty, who has and who doesn't have what they don't have, who is getting the resources, the jobs, et cetera, and who isn't. And perhaps even the one drawing this line has some kind of say in who gets the resources, is responsible for where this line gets drawn. So there's a sense of privilege on the one hand, and the have-nots on the other, that sort of match up with this idea of high and low. And just to jump ahead for a second, this reminds me of a quote by a Mizrahi activist, Chaim Hanegbi, who was in the group, the Israeli Black Panthers, who we'll talk about in a minute. And he is quoted as saying, quote, "In what was known as the high windows of the authorities and in the government, they know the dimensions of poverty and discrimination much more than we do, who come from below." So, and this is relates to a kind of anecdote when the Mizrahim began to protest, and they formed a group called the Israeli Black Panthers, or Pantherim Ashchorim. They noticed early on that with their protests, that there was a very strong reaction from the government. And they were a little confused. There was like a kind of a sense of fear on the part of the government towards these protests. And then they figured out that perhaps this fear came from the fact that the government actually knew about, inequalities and discrimination, and they had the facts and the numbers and the statistics about this. And they knew even more than the Mizrahim themselves, who had been living in the Mahabharat or in the development towns, and that they knew something was wrong, the protesters, but now they knew that the Israeli government knew that there was something to actually protest. And so, so with this kind of reading, we can see that there is this emphasis, of course, on poverty in the poem. We have in the very title, there's poverty. And then in the first sentence, there's poverty, the word poverty, and it reappears in the last sentence. And it's particularly striking in the Hebrew original, because the very shape of the poem points to this idea of poverty and who's above it and who's below it, because the poem itself all is written in these different lines, and the very last word in the Hebrew is oni, and it sort of like dangles down below the rest of the poem. So, and there's like the term for this, where like a poem's shape reflects its meaning. It's either called a shape poem or a concrete poem, or sometimes a calligram. So the very shape is sort of reinforcing this idea of poverty, and that there are those above it and there are those below this poverty line. And so when we look at the other images from the poem, focusing on this concept of poverty, we can look and see that there is like this bread made black with cheap makeup, right? There's like this meager subsistence. It's a little bit evocative of lechem oni, right? Or poor man's bread. And then as we go on, we see that there's, this bell, this kerosene vendor, and there's the sound of rubber boots landing in the muddy ground. And as we just saw in those images of the Mahabharat, we're not talking about like paved sidewalks and streets and roads, but there's this kind of provisional sort of like dirt paths in the Mahabharat that are, not paved, they're makeshift, and they reflect a kind of lack of infrastructure, right? And so the speaker of the poem is sort of looking back and remembering, the sound of the muddy ground and the sound of the shoes in the muddy ground. And then we have the mention of a shanty, right? Or tzarif, and the transit camp itself, or Mahabharat, or Mahabharat. So we have these images that sort of all point to this sense of poverty and lack of infrastructure and perhaps even lack of care on the part of those who put the immigrants here. However, there's also a kind of turning point in this poem that can kind of problematize what I just laid out. And in the very lines where it says, I was a kid in a house called a shanty, right? That names the shanty, in a neighborhood they called a transit camp. we can look, and if we think about, so whose perspective is being centered here, what is really being described, we see that there's the speaker of the poem was a kid in a house, a bait, and that others, it's called the stami, or the impersonal voice, that the others called, that's called a shanty. And then in the Hebrew, it says, Haiti yeled, b'bayit shekaru lo tzarif. So like, Haim karu, like they called, right? Which is this impersonal way of speaking. And then we have the speaker also saying in a neighborhood, shchuna, naming this neighborhood that they called, she'amru alea, that they said of it was a Mahabharat, was the transit camp. So here we have this kind of inside and outside, where the speaker's personal voice and personal experience is of living in a house, in a neighborhood, in a kind of collective space with others within a community. And then there's this kind of like defining or seeing from the outside, spoken in the stami, or in personal voice in Hebrew, that sort of suggests, you know, outsiders, or the kind of like one, or the they, right? That we sometimes speak of. So we can think of really these ideas of a shanty and a transit camp coming from the outside, coming from outsiders, people who are not living in the Mahabharat. Perhaps they're part of the establishment, or perhaps they're the Ashkenazim, or those with power, those who designate, you know, the space and draw the poverty line. And also perhaps the ones who know, who have the statistics and the actual knowledge of the inequality as well. But the speaker here, in a sense, inverts this power relationship, because he insists on this idea of house, and bait, as we know, resonates like very strongly within Hebrew, as not only a house or a home, but also we have, you know, the Beit HaMikdash, like the temple, right? Like the first two temples that suggest a kind of, you know, spiritual wholeness and a specific kind of spiritual national past. So there's this naming, you know, the speaker is defining the space from the inside and pointing to a kind of social connection of being a part in a neighborhood, and focusing on his own experience and the power of describing his own memories, and not how people saw it, describing it, not how people saw it from the outside, but from the inside. And once we have that kind of frame for reading the poem, and we go back to the poem and read it a second time, we can see that, you know, so we have this bread made black with cheap makeup, and it's also there along with olives in a small plate. So we think of bread as, you know, bread and water is something is like very, you know, the food of the poor, but olives are already, we're in a different kind of place right here. They're luscious. They grow in this area. They're delicious, and that they're on a small plate, and it's not on just a table, you know, a makeshift kind of table, but they're on a tablecloth. There's like some care that the residents have put into the living space, and we have the sound of the bells and the vendors, and with a red cart, right? That is like red is also like an image of vitality, and we have that sound of the muddy rain, of the muddy ground after rain, and the sound of boots, which can almost, you know, like we're being really drawn in centrally and orally and tactilely into the space of nostalgia of childhood. And this just reminds me, this idea of rain and the shanties. A good friend of mine from my synagogue is from Jamaica. And she was just telling me, actually in another webinar that we put on together, about her childhood in Jamaica, that one of her most salient memories is the sound of rain falling on tin roofs in the house where she used to live. And that there is something that we don't hear in New York, in the US, but that particular sound of the rain brings back all of these memories of childhood, of reading books inside and all the wonderment that is associated with her past, and the smells, and just like all of that experience. And if we turn back to this poem, the rain and the olives put together, and then there's also mention of the doves, right? That soar, that flew with a soaring salute, right? So we have this kind of something is able to transgress or to not transgress, but to sort of like cross the borders between the high and the low, between the poverty and the one above, and it's these doves. And sort of the juxtapositioning of these images is sort of evocative of the story of the dove branch. And we also, if we think again about the lechem oni, it's also, you know, it's the matzah that commemorates the exodus from Egypt. Kind of, and the lachma ania, the all who are hungry come to eat. So we have this idea of sharing bread, sharing food with others, the sense of creating a community. And with the Noah story, just to jump back to the Noah before we go back to the Exodus, is that in the Noah story, there's a sense of it, you know, after the flood is when we have the doves and the olive branch, and there's the sense of having reached a new home. But there was a sense of danger, a sense of chaos and disruption, but then there's a homecoming, which underscores the poet's insistence on calling the, you know, where he lived a house and not just a shanty. And so all of this together really like draws the reader into the poem and into the oral, tactile experiences of childhood, and the sounds of bells and the sounds of boots. And all of this really comes to life in the poem. And even the very language of the poem, that I don't know if many of you have studied or read or know a lot about Hebrew poetry, but you know, early Hebrew poetry, even if we think of like Bialik in modern poetry, it's very dense. There's an enormous amount of allusion and intertextuality, and there's like what's called like a melitza, or kind of like really high language. And so when you read it, you really have to sit there, you know, with some Sitzfleisch to go through and to penetrate the meaning of these poems. And students have expressed this to me. And then when I share this poem with students, they're like, whoa, this is like, it invites them in. It's a very colloquial, spoken kind of Hebrew that is meant to communicate, to share, to let people into the experience, to create a kind of conversation. And even the first word is, you know, ki'ilu, which in modern Hebrew, it's, if you want to say something like, you know, when you're talking and you kind of forget what you're saying and you want to pause, you can be like, ki'ilu kazeh. So it has this very colloquial sense. So, so all of this together really gives us an emphasis on the voice of someone who has experienced the Mahabharat from the inside, and a kind of inverts and deconstructs in many ways this kind of hierarchy of above and below, of the haves and the have-nots, by inverting that and creating a kind of space in the poem that is one of connection, a horizontal connection with the other, with the reader, with letting someone into this experience and seeing both speaker and reader as on an equal terms. And is that instead of the authorities looking from above, sort of pigeonholing this group of people, determining their social status and their need from the outside, looking down, it's we have the inside experience. At the same time, though, it can still be read as a protest poem because there is still mention of all of this poverty. So it's not letting authorities, or it's not letting the state off the hook at the same time, because it is calling attention to this kind of hierarchy and inequality. So I'm going to pause here, and I would love to hear from you. Questions about any of this, or also thoughts or insights to the poem, or anything really that you would like to share. So I'll stop sharing this for a second.
It's such a wonderful, it's such a wonderful and powerful poem, and you just gave so many layers of depth and meaning to it. So thank you so much. One person just reacting to the last line sort of paraphrased it as he wrote, "Everything within the horizon is poor, the whole known universe," which I thought was a powerful way of putting it.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So, okay, and then the person just chimed in, the same person just chimed in, noting that he wrote, "The use of color and specificity, the olives and all that, suggests that he doesn't see poverty within his own world," which is such a, I think, such a phenomenon for people who have grown up poor and I'm sorry, and just distracting noises here, and and then made it out of that, sort of the different ways in which you reflect back on your childhood, and the ways you didn't know you were poor. Right, sometimes we experience that. Sometimes people are most hard hit by difficult circumstances, including poverty, when they're out of it, and when you're in it, you can still experience wonderful parts of the world. Okay, so we talked before about how, you're a literary, you're a scholar of literature and not a historian. We definitely had a handful of questions about historical context. But let me just, before I get to those, let me just ask, there were a few questions about the cheap makeup and what's going on with that? How does that relate to bread? Someone suggested, is the dark bread, the Mizrahi themselves, sort of darker skin, or anyway, what's going on with the makeup on the bread there?
Oh, that's a good question and insight. Yeah, it's very evocative, and also like just personally, and students have commented on this too. Like, what does that mean? And but I'm thinking of maybe, it's just kind of like, some sort of black bread that may maybe not be very fresh. It's not like a, baguette from the corner bakery. And that maybe, there's some kind of spread that they're putting on the bread to make it like more palatable. Yeah, there's just this sense of like that, the cheapness, again, that there is the social reality, the economic reality of poverty that is always at play, but also sort of juxtaposed with these other images. But if anyone else in the group, any one of the other 195 of you have other thoughts about the cheap makeup, I would love to hear it. So I invite you to weigh in.
Okay, great. Someone asked if the boots are potentially meant to evoke concentration camps, or if that's not what's happening here. Right, that's not that wouldn't be the experience of this author. So do we just sort of eschew that possibility, or is that maybe something absorbed from larger Israeli culture?
Yeah, because I don't know that was like the immediate association, like the Holocaust imagery, but you wonder like whose rubber boots? Is it just like anyone? Is it some kind of authority figure going around checking? Or is it just simply because we have, like, it's just rained, it's like these details like sort of don't jump out at first. We're just sort of like getting oriented and poverty and above and below, but there's a really specific scene of there having been rain. And so I think that, it's definitely the squishiness of like the sound of rubber boots, but also, the promise that rain brings. It brings life, essentially. So that's how I read it, and not within a Holocaust frame.
We just got some great comments just about the boots and the bread. So one person suggested maybe the bread is burned or over toasted. And then a few comments about the boots. So one person wrote, if you've been in the Negev during the muddy season, you know about boats, mud, and the need for boots. Someone wrote, no sidewalks, just mud. So that's both about the muddy season and about kind of the poverty. And then this was what I was thinking. One person wrote, do the boots represent someone who is above the poverty, who can afford the boots? So just if I can ask you these, just these few kind of contextual questions for, for short answers, not deep dives into history. I guess one question was, or I'll put a couple together here. How long did people stay there? Was it, and were there only Mizrahim there? Were there any European Jews passing through?
Yeah, those are good questions. So I think that this was really, like the beginning years of the state with the Mahabharat, and then, so I imagine that like by like the late 50s, early 60s, it's more development towns and houses, and that for the most part, while there may have been some other, there were other immigrants during this time as well, that I have in my notes here. I think there was like some Bulgarian immigrants at this time as well. So while there were a lot of times when immigrants from other countries, from your European countries, they wouldn't be settled in the Mahabharat. They would go and join the other communities of the Ashkenazim. And this was like a very, like a thorn in the side. And even later on with, Russian Olim in later years in the 80s and all of this, whenever there would be like a new group of like Russian immigrants, they would also be, they would get absorbed differently. They were not stuck in like, these places. They were absorbed. They were given all kinds of benefits of citizenship that the Mizrahim were not given. It was a different moment in Israel's history, but historians have pointed to that there was like, it's like seeing the difference, like right before you. This is how they treat us, and this is how they treat these other groups who are also immigrants, who are also just coming here, and so I see this the way my understanding, and again, I'm not a historian, but some of my best friends are, and some of my favorite books are written by historians, that this is really like a unique to the Mizrahi experience.
Okay, that's helpful. We've some very knowledgeable participants here. So I'll just share a couple of their responses to what you just said. So one person wrote, there's evidence that the placement of the immigrants, I guess the Mizrahi immigrants, into development towns and these camps first was a purposeful strategy to have them as a buffer between Palestinians and the Ashkenazi population, which is pretty interesting. And someone also shared that rubber boots in Israel would be a sign of poverty. They're the cheapest boots possible, not stylish in any way. So maybe the rubber boots kind of go with the olives and the burnt bread. They're sort of the people. Okay, I have more questions, but I think I know you have so much more to share with us. I think we should stop here, and so you can continue.
Okay, terrific. And I also I want to see all these questions at the end because I really I know that this is like a webinar format. This is very different, but there's like the back and forth of reading poems with other people. That's my favorite thing, like in the world to do. And so I'm excited that if you have a thought, even if it's later on, like please share it. And so so I can see it and even perhaps reach out to you. So moving along a bit with some before reading the next poem called "The Milk Underground." And so as we said, the poem we just read, the Poverty Line, it can also be read as a protest poem, even though it's also about nostalgia and memory. And the other two poems that we'll be looking at, they're more sort of pronounced in the voice of protest. And the poems are part of like a history of protest by Mizrahi activists. So there's some speaking of historians, there's some very interesting research that suggests by historian Brian K. Roby that he wrote a book, The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 to 1966. So in his book, he speaks about how while a lot of historians see like actual like protest movements by the Mizrahim as only beginning like more like in 1959 or so, that he's actually done research using police reports and writings from the Mahabharat, and has identified that there were actually protests very early on, that there were the beginnings of organizing, that the Mizrahim were like aware of the situation, and they were doing something about it. They were, you know, getting together, they were protesting, they were trying to get the attention of the authorities. And we know that now, you know, because Roby is looking back at these other kinds of archives that historians hadn't looked at before. So we could say, given his work, Roby's work, that there had been a history of protest all along. But for the most part, historians at large of the Mizrahim, they sort of point to this particular moment in 1959, which occurred, this protest in the Wadi Salib neighborhood, that is seen as really putting the Mizrahi protester on the map, as this is seen as the first time that there was this kind of connection being made between ethnicity and discrimination and poverty. And so in this neighborhood, it was mostly inhabited by Moroccan Israelis. And a lot of them were young people who had served in the IDF, and some had even fought in the War of Independence, and then they could not find work, and they had no means of advancement. So they protested, and the protest didn't last long. There were some minor adjustments, the government made some adjustments, and their wages were slightly raised, and child allowances were provided. But the protest movement that really, that people think about perhaps the most, and that was in many ways the most striking, was the Israeli Black Panthers. So this is a group that formed in 1971, and they of course like took their name from the original Black Panthers in the US, the Black Power movement. And so the Israeli Black Panthers, or Pantherim Hashforim, began, as I said, 1971 in Jerusalem, around this neighborhood, the Mizrahi neighborhood, where a lot of immigrants lived. And it was begun, the group was begun by social activists and social workers who worked with gangs in poor neighborhoods. So they did a lot of demonstrations in the 70s, and they called attention to the discrimination mainly against North African Mizrahim. And they were speaking out against the humiliation and poverty. So, and just to have like some statistics there, in 1971, a fifth of the Mizrahim were living below the poverty line. The Ashkenazi families were earning 30% more. 55% of Mizrahi adolescents were not in school, and only 1% of university students were Mizrahim. And the Mizrahim were frequently stopped by police and suspected of crimes. And, you know, there was a sense of like policing, like we have in the US today also with people of color. So, and I just want to, it's important to note, again, I'm not a sociologist or historian, but I just wanted to point to the fact that these statistics are not random, but rather they're the reflection of a systemic inequality in different government policies that had been implemented. Just like very briefly, that there were educational policies that were implemented that established essentially like 2 tracks for high schools, and an academic track, which, you know, was essentially for the Ashkenazim, for these schools, and then a more vocational track, which was in effect, you know, at the end of the day, it was created for the Mizrahim. And there's an historian and writer, Sami Shalom Chetrit, who has written about this in his book, over here, Intra-Jewish Conflict in Israel, White Jews, Black Jews. And so he points to this you know, inequality in the schools. And he also talks about like grouping in education, that students were sort of grouped in certain ways, and that some were then promoted and could continue and make great achievements, and other students were essentially held back. So, so of course, education is very central and has a great ability to affect students' future professions and economic status. And then, so there's all kinds of sort of policies that you see coming up in the 50s and 60s and on, that, you know, around education, around housing, around economic issues that led to a kind of systemic inequality. So the Israeli, I just wanted to say the Israeli Black Panthers, they had big protests, and they also engaged in some controversial tactics. And one thing that they would do is they would steal milk from well-off Jerusalem neighborhoods and distribute it to the poorer Mizrahi areas, to the households in these other neighborhoods, which is also actually reminiscent of the American Black Panthers who instituted this kind of breakfast program that they were interested in feeding children before school, and they fed tens of thousands of hungry children that helped to create that contributed to the existence of federal free breakfast programs today. And that some historians have said that perhaps it's one of the most radical things that they did, the American Black Panthers, enabling children to learn, you know, without hunger, because once you have education, once you learn, then you can really do anything. So and then there was a huge demonstration, jumping back to the Israeli Black Panthers, on May 18th, 1971, called the Night of the Panthers, that saw, you know, between 5,000 and 7,000 protesters in Zion Square in Jerusalem. So what sort of put an end to their activities was the 1973 war, because there's always, you know, like when there's less of a imminent security threat, then there's times to focus on the interior situation of Israel and its society. But then when there's like a war, then everything gets really more focused on national security. And so the Black Panthers later, even after they disbanded, they in 1990, they created a kind of independent Knesset faction, and some of the leaders joined other political parties. But the Israeli Black Panthers were very successful in that they sort of raised awareness at this time, and they're still remembered today. And they also did other kinds of social work, assisting low-income families and helping people with addictions. So I want to share some images, and then we'll get to the next poem. Okay, so here I'm sharing a picture of a man named Saaria Marciano, who his dates are 1950 to 2007. And he was a Moroccan social activist and politician, and he was one of the key founders of the Israeli Black Panthers. And he went on to serve briefly in the Knesset in the 1980s. And I have some protest signs from this period, where we have Milchama ba'oni, lo ba'aniyim. So, you know, this essentially says, like, you know, war on poverty, not on the poor. And it says on the side, it's a little bit hard to read here. We have the power to achieve our rights. Enough of asking, enough of begging. The time has arrived to take our rights. And here's another sign from this period of the early 70s. Where the different protest signs are demanding full compensation for price increases for inflation. And it says the millionaires have millions, and the workers, we have rage. And then it says, like, the prices, we have like a kilo of sugar is 6, I guess that's lira. And a bottle of oil, and why don't they add to our paychecks? And another sign says on the far left, you know, shalom, lechem va'avodah, peace, bread, and work. Then in another image, we have the image of the fist, right, which is a popular protest symbol, and that eventually became part of the Black Power movement in the US, and the Black Fist. And here we have the Black Panthers in Israel, like, you know, using this image as well. And as we know today, that it's also become a symbol of BLM, or Black Lives Matter, in the US today. And so it's interesting, there's like this kind of transnational, flowing back, from the US, getting ideas and making connections between situations of systemic inequality in different places. So there's a lot of this kind of back and forth thinking. So here we also have an image of one of the Black Panthers. And I find this a very striking image because there's also like the Jewish star, that this is something that is very centered in the image, is that there's like a kind of Mizrahi identity, an activist identity, but at the same time, it's another way of expressing a Jewish identity. And thinking about this series on Jewish stories, like this is, at the end of the day, this is a Jewish story. And we have, there was a stamp issued in Israel of the Black Panthers, and then a street named after, in the Mizrahi neighborhood, where a lot of the activists came from in Jerusalem. This was named after them. This plaque was created in Jerusalem in 2011. So, and this is a picture of Ronny Someck standing in front of the words Machteret HaChalav, of the Milk Underground. So, so now moving to this poem. So this poem was from 2005. And it describes a scene in Tel Aviv that is in a neighborhood that is on the poverty line. And this is also the name of the collection of poems in which it appears, the Milk Underground. And it's about Mizrahi, Mizrahi neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. And I just wanted to say before reading the poem and starting to interpret it, that my reading of this poem was largely informed by another critic and poet and Mizrahi woman named Racheli Abraham Eitan. So she has a lot of poems out, and then she's written literary criticism, and her reading of this poem was very influential to me. And her family came from Yemen. So I want to make sure to center Mizrahi voices when I can. So, so I'll read the title and the poem, and then we'll start thinking about it. So the Milk Underground. The kids coming out of the empty fridge will roll trash cans and poke light out of the street lamp's eyes. In the great darkness, the most rotten tooth will gleam, biting into overstuffed cats, will suck leftover cream from their tongues, and the cream, fancy lady, has long since forgotten the teats of the cow that dripped her into this world. In the morning, the sun will rise, birds will announce the autumn, and there's nobody there to bring these lines closer to the nose to smell the milk underground. So if we think already just even about the title and this sort of emphasis on milk, perhaps several things come to mind, right? Milk is a very essential, for children, for people in general. Children need to have it. And it can be seen as a kind of metonymy, or a kind of representation for, all of the basic needs for nourishment, for the body and soul of a child. But we're already struck with this strange image because there's milk, but there's underground, right? Like, what does that mean? One has to go underground to get it. There's like there's not a direct access to this milk. And then this being a Hebrew poem and part of, tradition of Hebrew poetry, when we think of milk, it's also possible that we'll be thinking about, the land flowing with milk and honey from the Bible, and also from a lot of idealized images of the land, commemorated in a lot of like Hebrew poems from the third Aliyah period, from the pre-state period. There's a lot of poems about and being like kind of breasts and life-giving and giving milk, like the poetry of Shlonsky, and like the land being like the body of a woman. So we have that, but then instead of this kind of early Zionist bucolic utopia suggested by the land flowing with milk and honey, here we have an urban dystopia that we're introduced to. And then, of course, there's a reference to the Black Panthers, right? That milk is already associated in the Mizrahi context with a kind of protest, because there were taking the milk from the wealthy neighborhoods and bringing it to the poorer neighborhoods. So we have, this like reference to actual Mizrahi protests. So if we look at it, the kids coming out of the empty fridge, like what? It's this very arresting image. And we have this scene that's being described that we're kind of out in the streets, like we're outside, we're not in a house. And there's this refrigerator, right? So the refrigerator, again, not in a house, it's in the street and it's empty. So this can be seen as a kind of, a metaphor, empty refrigerator, lack of sustenance, lack of food, lack of nourishment, and that it's outside, that there's like this disjunction, like something is horribly wrong with this image. And it strikes us as odd and a little, and somewhat even scary or uncanny. And then we can see that there's also this very concrete social economic situation being described in these lines, that there are these kids, they're maybe playing hide and seek in these empty refrigerators. They will roll trash cans and poke light out of the street lamp's eyes. So again, the eyes that are in this poem, they're not the eyes of authority figures. There's not the eyes of parents. There's the eyes of the street lamps, that the children are outside when you would think of them, needing light and support inside, but they're out, and the eyes that are looking over them are these street lamps. And there's this also the sense of danger and disorientation, that we're not used to thinking of these things together in this way. And for this to be like a toy, like the empty refrigerator is essentially what they're playing with and part of their game, but it's a kind of a dump, right? We're in the street and there's a danger, like to be inside. I mean, it actually makes me very scared as a mom, like, oh no, they could get stuck in this refrigerator. It's there's a sense of danger, and it's also quite surreal. And then when we go down to the second and third lines, we spoke about the street lamp, sorry, jumping ahead. We see that that if we think about the tense of the poem, right? Like the kids coming out of the empty fridge, that sounds like the present tense in English, but there's the sense of like the future. In the Hebrew, there's the future. And then they will roll trash cans and poke light out of the streets in the great darkness, will gleam, biting into overstuffed cats. So there's a sense of the future, which is interesting, which I would love to ask you about why you think it would be in the future tense. And some thoughts right now that I've thought about and other students in the past have thought about is that it's kind of, it's almost like a forecast of the future, that the situation is so bad that it's not just describing a material reality of the moment, but it's sort of like looking like, where's all this going to lead? This will be the case also going forward because of these systemic inequalities and because of the unchanging situation in Israeli society that perpetuates the poverty line. And then we have this very grotesque image in the fourth line, in the great darkness, the most rotten tooth. So presumably the tooth of the children that is perhaps rotten because of a lack of milk, will gleam, biting into overstuffed cats, will suck leftover cream from their tongues. So it's as if, the cats have the cream and they're well fed, and it brings about like the image of like the fat cats, right? And how you say that in Hebrew is apparently chatul shamenet. That's how you say, it's like this idea of like sour cream and cats. So we have these fat cats, and for the children to actually have access to this, they have to like bite into these cats to get it. And so we have this kind of, this really grotesque image that emphasizes the situation and the disparity of the situation. And then again, if we circle back to the milk protests of the Black Panthers, there's apparently like a direct reference to this, because on March 14th, 1972, there was, one of these incidents of like taking the milk from the wealthy neighborhood and bringing it in Rehavia specifically, and bringing it to this area of Kiryat Yovel. And they put little flyers on these milk bottles, and the flyers read, quote, "Operation Milk for the children of poor neighborhoods. These children do not find every morning next to the door the milk they need. On the other hand, some dogs and cats in the rich neighborhoods have milk every day and plenty." So on these flyers, it seems to be that a lot of these images sort of like are directly sort of lifted from this act of protest, from these flyers. And there's this sense of anger and rage of the disparity between the wealthy and the poor, and of ostentatious wealth, these overstuffed cats on the one hand, and people who can afford to feed their domestic animals, like to feed these cats, while other families can't feed their own children. And then we have this image of the cream fancy lady, which I believe, the way I read it anyway, is that that's like a name brand of this kind of shemenet or cream. But it also points to a disparity between the fanciness of some and the poverty of others. And then it has long since forgotten the teats of the cow that dripped her into this world. So we have this like dairy product, and then there's this kind of like moment where we remember kind of like early Zionist notions of of working the land and the fruitfulness of the land and the milk that comes, the land of milk and honey. But that is all something somewhere else. Right now, we're in this very different urban reality, and that is something that is almost, forgotten. And then we have this reference here. In the morning, the sun will rise. Birds will announce the autumn, and there's no one there to bring these lines closer to the nose to smell the milk underground. So I think in the Hebrew, it's like Baboker Tizrach HaShemesh. So that is an allusion to Kohelet or to Ecclesiastes of nothing new under the sun. So there's this like moment of pessimism. This is the situation of these children. The situation will not change. And then it turns into this very like self-referential moment where it says, in the morning, the sun will rise. There's nobody there to bring these lines closer to the nose to smell the milk underground. So if we think about what is meant here by these lines, and in Hebrew, it's shorot. So it's perhaps, the very lines of the poem themselves. That nobody is there, to do this. So this is the job of the poet, of the speaker of the poem, to bring this reality to the reader, and to jar the reader into taking action, into acknowledging this and to doing something about it. And to smell, again, we have this very like sensual, tactile, kind of, like olfactory sense of like, smelling kind of like rotted milk or something like this. And that this poem is meant to really almost kind of like break the fourth wall, like in drama, and just really like, okay, enough of the poem. I'm talking to you, the reader, to bring the situation and to shatter people's complacency. And what's also interesting about the poem is that it doesn't follow like general rules of poetry, in the sense that there's no rhyming in the poem. And there is, assonance and alliteration with like, shamenet, giveret, migunderet, like there's, within the lines, there's like the play of phonemes of vowel sounds. But it's not meant to be this very beautiful poem that sort of lulls you in iambic pentameter through rhymes, but rather to do just the opposite, to sort of like shatter one's sense of reality and complacency. So one can really pay attention to the dire situation. So again, this is, about social problems, the urban environment, and it's not meant to be, there's not many, metaphors, but it's really trying to bring the sense back of actual hunger. So I will stop here, and I would love to hear any thoughts, questions, insights about the poem or Black Panthers or anything that this has brought up for you.
Okay, we have lots of comments. I just want to do a time check because we only have 12 minutes left. So how do you want to handle it? Because we definitely have 12 minutes worth of questions. Do you want to maybe like briefly show us one more poem, and then we'll spend the rest of the time? You won't be able to analyze it in the same way, but I don't know, that's a thought, maybe just to be able to share one more with us, because they're so powerful, but I defer to you, because it's certainly true that, I mean, my what I was getting out of that poem by the end of your explication was 1,000 times more than when I first read it. So I defer to you on how to spend the rest of the time. I just wanted to kind of flag it.
I think it would be good to hear from people, because I don't know, I think it's like that we're talking about this, that this is, the sense of community, and I would love to hear some thoughts. And then I'll close with some discussion of Adi Keissar, who's just like a fabulous poet. And so I'll say a few things about her poem, but I think it would be great to hear something from.
Okay, great. And everyone has the poems in their packet as well, so at least we can read them. There were some really, I have comments on the first poem, comments on the second poem, broader comments and questions. Really interesting comments on the cats in this last poem. So, anyone who's spent time in Israel in recent decades knows that cats there are like rats here in New York anyway. And I'm not sure, I know that it wasn't always like that. So I'm not sure, when the poem was written in the context of when the cats became the issue that they are today, but there were a couple interesting comments about that. So one person wrote, historically in Jerusalem and perhaps elsewhere, there was animosity toward cats by the poor because they would steal food that people could ill afford to lose. And then another comment about the cats, there's so many, not just pet cats, but so many street cats in Israel that people put food out for, while this person wrote, while they turn away from the poor Mizrahi children who are also on the street. So I thought those were interesting comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there is something about this image of cats, and I know exactly what you mean, what all of you mean about the street animals in Israel, that it is like a really specific thing about that place, about Israel. And that they're just outside, and that they are kind of rummaging through trash and getting the leftovers, the surplus of what the more wealthy families have. Thank you for that.
This person actually followed up saying that my parents grew up in the 1920s, and cats were already a problem then, and they would steal meat from outdoor pantries. Okay, and I was just looked at the cream. I was thinking when you were going through that part, it's almost like the cream is personified along with the cats. It's like, here are these overstuffed cats who have eaten all this food that we don't get to eat, and the cream is so also sort of doesn't realize how lucky it is, or the place of riches that it's come from. I don't know if you think that's how I was reading The Fancy Lady. I don't know if you think that's a good read.
Yeah, it's like where the cream and the cats are like personified, like they're sort of like spoken about as if they're people in this way, and whereas like the actual children who are the real concern of the poem, that they become then like dehumanized, in juxtapositioning between that. And there's this fancy lady, like it's a gesture towards capitalist culture, and all of that. It's just fancy products, and who can get them and who can't get them, and who has access and who doesn't. So I agree with you on that.
There were some more comments on the first poem. If you want to, do you want to take those?
Yeah.
Okay, or I can at least share them. And we don't need to discuss them, but there was more discussion of the black bread, and one person suggested that like dark bread is made from unrefined flour, and I mean now we all eat our whole wheat, whole grain food, but might have been a food of the poor. unlike kind of fancier, more expensive bread that's made from white flour, which we now know is less nutritious. And the person said also that olives in Israel were considered food for poor people, something available locally and readily available. So those are things that have changed since then, but might be some useful historical context. And there was a question about the home, the one that was translated as shanty. So this person wrote, so in the lines about a bayit they called a shanty and a neighborhood they called a Mahabharat, is it possible that the third person there hints that, I'm just going to read how this person wrote it, that Ashkenazim couldn't conceive that Mizrahi might have been bourgeoisie in their countries of origin. There might have been different levels of society there. For the Ashkenazi establishment, all of Mizrahi culture is somehow inferior, and this sort of absorption was appropriate, as opposed to how Ashkenazim were absorbed more directly into Israeli culture, maybe in a kind of more naturally stratified way, as opposed to like Mizrahi all goes to the bottom.
Yes, and that actually segues into where I was going to go anyway in introducing the last poem. As I was going to talk about, this idea of like Orientalism that was prevalent at this time among, Europeans, that the founders of the state of Israel, like they came, the first Olim during the Aliyot, they came from Europe and they brought European attitudes. And one of them is what, we have this term Orientalism that was coined by Edward Said. And there's this whole kind of attitude about people who come from the Middle East, and on the part of Europeans, sort of like looking down at Easterners and seeing them as more primitive, as Europe is like the place of culture and of progress, whereas, the East is danger and it's primitive and there's something threatening and lurking, and that there was this attitude towards Mizrahim that they needed, that the Israelis who were already settled there needed to somehow civilize these people. It did not recognize that the Mizrahim came from cultures and languages and foods and literature and all of these other things, didn't see them as just equals, but saw them as like, oh no, like it's really on us to teach them how to really be, how to be civilized. So this attitude, and there was, this sense in the last poem that we won't really have time to read together, but just for reading on your own, that this poem by Adi Keissar, Ani Mizrahit, I am the Mizrahit, is a response to this, is a response to all of the kind of ideas that have been associated with the Mizrahim as seen as somehow threatening, of these people speaking Arabic, which is the language of the enemy, having these other customs and cultures that are like they don't really belong here. And so she sort of points to this and she calls out that attitude and she brings it in. She brings in and talks about her identity as a Mizrahit. And so the idea of, we've been using the word Mizrahi and as an adjective and Mizrahim as a noun, but Mizrahit, she puts the feminine ending on it to point both to gender, to the feminine gender, and also to the Mizrahiness. And also by using this word in the title and throughout the poem, she points to this almost like the creation of a new language. That like in Hebrew, when we talk about languages, we have like Anglit or Ivrit or Aravit. And so she uses this, Mizrahit, it's like this, it's an attempt to create another language that brings together all of these disparate parts, all of these things that the establishment, the Ashkenazi establishment has been trying to bring apart with the Mizrahim, to take them away from like the Arabic language, to, quote, civilize them and not acknowledge their own culture and that they brought with them and that they've developed here in Israel. So she creates this whole kind of like new identity and really adds and enriches, the Jewish experience of Israelis and of all of us, of Jewish stories and storytelling. So I think that we're really at the end though. So, but there's always more chances to read poetry. I'm sure that we'll have another, somewhere in the JTS universe, have another opportunity to look at these wonderful poems.
This was such a wonderful session, and yeah, I'm flooded with really amazing comments that we can't do any of them in 2 minutes. So I just want to tell everyone that that I will be sharing the full chat, and Tani will as well, and Ellie with Dr. Bailis, so she'll see all your comments. You invited people to be in touch. I don't know if do you want to share your email?
Sure.
Or we can put it in the chat if you want to just give it to us.
Yeah. Oh, JTSA.
Okay, so it's B-E Bayless, B-E-B-A-I-L-I-S at jtsa.edu. And
Oh, that's right. Not everybody can see the chat. Sorry.
okay, Ellie just shared it with everyone. This was wonderful, and I feel this was eye-opening for me. And I mean, I didn't even know that Edora Mizrahi began as a pejorative term that has been reclaimed the way the word queer has, and the poems are just are so powerful, and the way you unpack them for us really showed their power. And I think they really did address, you know, the kinds of stories and storytelling questions we're trying to raise in the series. What is the function of stories like this? And you really showed these poems as personal stories, and the kind of larger stories they're trying to tell about what's happening in Israeli society. So thank you so much. It's really wonderful, and we hope to have you back at another session. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and invite you back next week. We will be going way into the past with Dr. Benjamin Levy, who's another adjunct assistant professor. I hope you all appreciate just how wonderful it's been to have several adjunct and visiting faculty in this summer series. It's great to hear all these new voices. His session is called Alexander, Was He Great? Rabbinic Criticism of Rome Through Alexander Narratives. So we'll be looking at much older texts. Hope to see you all there, and thank you once again, Dr. Bayless, for teaching us today.
Thank you.